Cold open hook, the narrator describes the strange psychology of night driving, how cities look different after midnight, and how taxi drivers often see sights of people most others never do. Empty streets, flickering streetlights, and the quiet hum of the engine create a calm but uneasy atmosphere. The narrator explains that most rides are ordinary, but occasionally something happens that stays with the driver for years. One moment in particular is hinted at: a passenger who entered the car silently and gave an address that didn't exist anymore. The narrator reflects that driving strangers around at night means you sometimes pick up people whose stories don't quite add up. And sometimes, the narrator says, you realize halfway through the ride that something about the person in the back seat isn't right. The hook ends with the line, taxi drivers talk to each other, and some stories keep coming up again and again.
Transition, the narrator reflects on how drivers often try to explain strange encounters logically. After all, working late nights means exhaustion, long hours, and unusual passengers. It's easy to convince yourself that stress or fatigue caused the strange feeling you had during a ride. But drivers also share stories with each other during breaks or at taxi stands. And sometimes those stories sound unsettlingly similar. The narrator explains that one pattern comes up repeatedly: passengers who behave in ways that don't make sense until the ride is already underway. And by the time the driver realizes something is wrong, the situation has already gone too far to easily stop. Story 2: The Passenger Who Wouldn't Speak. Summary. A taxi driver working near an airport picks up a man standing alone at a nearly empty terminal entrance late at night. The passenger enters the car quietly and simply hands the driver a piece of paper with an address written on it. The man never speaks during the entire ride. At first, the driver assumes the passenger may not speak English, or may simply be tired from traveling. As the ride continues, the driver begins noticing small details that feel increasingly unsettling. The passenger never moves, never checks a phone, and seems to be staring straight ahead the entire time. The silence becomes uncomfortable, especially during long stretches of empty highway. The driver eventually attempts casual conversation, but the man gives no response. That's when the driver begins to feel a strange sense of being watched from the back seat. When they reach the address, it leads to an empty industrial parking lot. The driver turns around to ask if the passenger is sure about the location, but the back seat is empty. The driver immediately checks the doors, expecting that the man must have exited while the car slowed down. But both doors remain locked. The driver spends the rest of the night trying to convince himself there was a logical explanation. Yet the piece of paper with the address remains on the seat, exactly where the passenger had been holding it. Transition, the narrator explains that drivers eventually learn to trust their instincts. When something feels wrong during a ride, it usually is. But the problem is that drivers can't always act on that feeling. When someone enters the car, the ride has already begun. The narrator reflects that most drivers develop habits to stay safe, checking mirrors frequently, keeping routes predictable, and avoiding isolated areas. Still, sometimes the situation changes before the driver even realizes it. Story 1: The Last Pickup of the Night. A driver working a late shift in a quiet suburban area receives one final dispatch before ending his night. The pickup location is an older residential street where most of the houses appear dark and abandoned. At first, the driver assumes the request might be a mistake, but a woman eventually emerges from the darkness and gets into the back seat without saying much. She provides an address across town, speaking quietly and avoiding conversation. During the ride, the driver notices unusual details. The woman never checks her phone, never looks out the window, and speaks only when necessary. The driver begins to feel uneasy when she asks him to take an unfamiliar route through poorly lit roads. This is where things start to stop making sense. As the ride continues, the driver tries to rationalize the situation. Maybe she's tired. Maybe she just wants privacy. But when they arrive near the destination, the passenger suddenly asks him to stop several blocks early. When he turns around to confirm the fare, the back seat is empty. At first, he assumes she left quickly without him noticing, but there are no footsteps, no open doors, and no sign of anyone nearby. The driver eventually convinces himself that he must have been distracted for a moment. But days later, when checking the dispatch history, he realizes the pickup request was never actually logged in the system. The driver ends the story with a lingering thought. He still remembers the silence in the back seat and the feeling that someone was there longer than they should have been. Story 3: The Ride That Kept Changing Destination. A driver picks up a young man late at night outside a convenience store. The passenger initially gives a clear destination several miles away. Everything about the ride begins normally. But after a few minutes, the passenger suddenly asks the driver to turn down a different road instead. At first, the driver assumes the passenger simply changed his mind. But the pattern repeats several times during the ride. Every few minutes, the passenger gives a new direction, guiding the taxi into quieter and more isolated neighborhoods. The driver starts to feel uneasy, wondering whether the passenger might be trying to lead him somewhere unsafe. The tension builds as the roads become darker and less populated. The driver considers ending the ride early, but the passenger remains calm and polite, which makes the situation harder to interpret. The worst part isn't what the driver says, it's the growing realization that he has no idea where they're actually going. Eventually, the passenger asks the driver to stop near a wooded area on the outskirts of town. As the driver turns around to confirm payment, the passenger calmly steps out and disappears into the darkness without looking back. The driver later checks the trip record and notices something unsettling. The original destination entered in the system had never changed. Story 4. The fare that called back a driver working a graveyard shift receives a call for a pickup at a quiet apartment building. The ride begins normally, with a passenger who seems friendly, but strangely distracted. During the ride, the passenger repeatedly glances behind the car, as if expecting someone to follow them. The driver begins to feel uncomfortable, but tries to rationalize the behavior. Perhaps the passenger is nervous or dealing with personal problems. But the tension escalates when the passenger suddenly asks the driver to stop the car and claims they've arrived, even though they're still several blocks from the address. After the passenger leaves, the driver assumes the ride is finished. But 20 minutes later, the same phone number calls the dispatch again, requesting another pickup at the exact same apartment building. When the driver returns to the location, the building appears completely dark and empty. The narrator reflects that drivers sometimes encounter passengers who seem to appear and disappear without explanation. But what unsettled this driver most was realizing he had already dropped that same passenger off earlier in the night. Final closing reflection, the narrator reflects that taxi drivers spend thousands of hours alone with strangers in confined spaces. Most rides blur together and are quickly forgotten. But every driver eventually experiences one ride that lingers in their memory long after the shift ends. The unsettling part is not always what happened, but the parts that never quite made sense afterward. The addresses that don't exist anymore, the passengers who vanished too quickly, the routes that seem to lead nowhere. The narrator ends with a quiet reflection. I've talked to a lot of drivers over the years, and the strange thing is, the details change, but the feeling doesn't. It's always the same moment when you glance in the rearview mirror and suddenly realize the ride isn't what you thought it was.